Good evening, everyone, and good evening those of you who are attending at the Law Auditorium. I'm Jeffrey Henderson, Dean of Arts and Sciences at Boston University, and it is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome our community of faculty, students, alumni, and friends to celebrate and inaugurate the first lecture in our new annual lecture series honoring Howard Zinn, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, who was a member of our faculty from 1964 to 1988. The Zinn lectures will feature speakers who, like Professor Zinn himself, offer provocative commentary on the issues and politics of the day. And our day is a day that needs them no less than any other day I can remember. Howard Zinn's contribution to the Department of Political Science, the university, and the national and political discourse are too many and too well known for me to have to rehearse them here. My own kids discovered Howard Zinn's writings in high school and were very impressed that he taught at the same university I did. So I finally got some respect from them. Professor Zinn has been an inspiration and mentor to many, and we hope that the Zinn lectures will highlight his rich legacy for future generations of Boston University students and the wider community. We owe the inauguration of the Zinn lectures to the vision and financial support of an alumnus, Alex McDonald, CGS class of 70 and Arts and Sciences class of 72, and his wife, Dr. Maureen Strafford, Medical School, 1976. They created this endowment as their tribute to Howard Zinn and to ensure that his work will be remembered by future generations of students and scholars at Boston University. We hope that the generosity of Alex and Maureen will encourage others to reflect on the influence that Howard Zinn has had in their lives. Alex McDonald is a founding partner of the law firm McDonald, Rothweiler, Eisenberg, a Boston and Philadelphia-based consultancy representing plaintiffs in complex personal injury, medical malpractice, pharmaceutical, and product liability litigation. I have to make sure those stairs are secure over there. His cases include, most notably, the largest wrongful death recovery in the history of Massachusetts in the first fen-phen diet pill death case filed in the United States. Maureen Strafford is a pediatric anesthesiologist at New England Medical Center. They are the proud parents of 2 daughters, and of course we hope that at least one of them will follow in their parents' footsteps by attending Boston University. On behalf of Boston University, the College of Arts and Sciences, and David Mayers, chair of the Department of Political Science, our thanks to Alex McDonald and Dr. Strafford. So I give you Alex McDonald.
Thank you, Dean Henderson, and thank you for all being here. The people in this auditorium with us physically, those who are sitting in the law school auditorium, joining us through the virtual reality of television. It is a great pleasure to call myself a proud son of the class of 72 here at the College of Arts and Sciences, that lucky and charmed generation of students who got to spend 1968 to 1972, certainly among, if not the most politically charged, historically significant, socially oriented 4 years that a young man or woman could imagine spending on campus. But because of the man that we're here to honor tonight, the campus life was not merely the life of the classroom, and it was not merely the life of the library. It was, for so many of us, a life that took the lessons of the classroom and applied them in literal senses in the common square of the community, on the streets of the community, in the gathering spots of Boston Common and the ellipse in front of the White House, where we gave our points of view to President Nixon, and around the Washington Monument and so many other places. And that geography had something in common, because wherever people of passion gathered, there was a common thread in the form of a common speaker. Common only in the sense that he was there whenever he was called upon, but uncommon in his zeal and his passion. And that's the man that we're gathering to honor tonight. My hope is that in a real sense, what we will experience over the next couple of hours is Boston University's non-musical version of the climactic scene in Mr. Holland's opus. And Howard and his beloved Roz are great movie fans, and he understands the illusion. The illusion that a great teacher whose life is chronicled over the decades, a man who, as opposed to political science and the world of history, thought that his passions and his contribution as a teacher would lay in the realm of music, only discovers in the later years of his life, at the conclusion of his teaching career, that his masterpiece, that his opus, was not the notes in the musical literature, but rather the countless notes in the form of the students that he touched over his decades in the classroom. And what was true for Mr. Holland is particularly true for the man we gathered to honor tonight. Now, there are many thanks to be given, and I must say that the dean was generous beyond propriety in the singling Maureen and myself out. We are simply the lucky folks who were in a position to start the fund that gives rise to tonight's celebration, but it's a fund that we hope will be supplemented by other people who've been touched by our guest of honor, by his writings, by his words, by his example, and so that 10 years and 20 years and 50 years from now, people will gather in this place on an evening like tonight and be inspired by the example of our honoree. In pulling this together, it would be immodest to suggest that we played any role more than the initial domino in an easy line of dominoes that fell, because once the idea entered our consciousness to honor our guest of honor, the word went out, and countless other people here at BU and in the greater Boston community joined as well with their time and their passion. Three people need to be singled out, and those are friends of Howard's and Roz, who immediately agreed to supplement David Myers and other members of the political science faculty in comprising the board of advisors, the people who will select each year's speaker. They are in two instances with us tonight, in the flesh and the other by proxy, and I'd like them to stand in a moment when the last name is uttered to receive your welcome. First, these are writers all, men and women of immense talent who know Howard not just professionally, but socially and personally, and love him. We begin with that gifted writer, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, a treasure for all of us in Boston, but a treasure in no small part because her writings have now for decades appeared in over 400 newspapers every week as a gold model of what feminism and rational thought and the good life, measured by values that matter, is all about. Ellen Goodman of the Boston Globe. In each instance, these are people that I am very proud to be able to call friends. But our next member of the committee, who's traveled up from New York, is a person bonded not only to me, but much more intimately and much longer period of time with my wife, Maureen, her high school friend of over 40 years, her Barnard classmate, going back 30-odd years, the head of the English department at Barnard at present, but much more importantly, one of the most elegant, gifted, beautiful writers that our generation has produced, the author of Final Payments, The Company of Women, last year's Pearl, a masterpiece, and the just issued The Collected Stories of Mary Gordon. And in the interest of chromosomal diversity, we realized we better have a man join the group as well, but it was not gender bias, it was talent, once again, that caused the selection. The request was made, and instantaneously, as with Ellen, as with Mary, our final member of the Board of Trustees, member of the selection committee, said he would happily be part of this for all the time that may be gifted to him over the decades ahead. And this man has particular ties to Boston University. He was, during my time, the Catholic chaplain over at Newman House. He has gone on from a life of literal spirituality to a much greater, broader, more important, more public spirituality as a writer of incredible insight and moral sensitivity. James Carroll is not with us tonight, but his wife, the equally talented novelist Alexandra Marshall, is. I'd ask all three to stand. Now, some of you may have eclectic tastes in music, as I certainly do, and notwithstanding a Dorchester upbringing, I have a great passion for all kinds of melodies and all kinds of music, save opera, because I'm ignorant, but I do love country western music. And some of you who share that interest and passion may be familiar with an early 70s ballad, a lovely tone poem about heroes, sung by the great, recently deceased Waylon Jennings and his partner in the musical life, Willie Nelson. And the title of that song was, "My Heroes Have Always Been Cowboys." Well, the problem with the Dorchester upbringing in the late 50s and 1960s is that there were so few cowboys for young males or females to emulate. And so at 18, traveling on the Red Line and the Green Line for the first couple of years of my formal education, I would, kind of like Dorchester's answer to Dorothy, come out of the black and white world at one end of the Red Line, and each morning get deposited near Kenmore Square, walk the yellow brick road of Commonwealth Avenue, and encounter great wizards who had a tremendous impact on one's life, teachers of all sorts of discipline. But the greatest wizard of all, the greatest teacher, is the man we're going to honor in a few seconds. And so the problem for me, understanding that cowboys were not literal role models, was how would I reframe that refrain? And it's really quite simple. From the age of 18 in 1968 up until this moment, it is quite true and candid and easy for me to say, my hero has always been Howard. And for those who know the song, the next lyric is equally appropriate, and he still is today. I'd ask you to join me in an event that is 84 years in the making. A half a lifetime ago, 42 years ago, our guest of honor began his teaching life at this university. But in looking through his collection of great works that sit in the library of my home the other night, from LaGuardian Congress through the politics of history, up through the seminal work on civil disobedience, a book that could not be more timely to our lives today as a culture and as a country, a book written in late 1966, early 1967, appropriately entitled Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. As Howard has often said, it was not a birth control manual. But what it was, for those of you lucky enough to secure a copy today, is the past as prologue. I invite anyone lucky enough to secure a copy to read those pages written 40 years ago, to substitute the word Vietnam for Iraq, and you will be bearing witness, as I was reminded the other night, to the gift of prophecy. Because everything said in that book about the logic of withdrawal from that war applies to the one tragically being waged today. So, looking through those books, the obvious suddenly jumped out at me, something that should have been apparent to me but wasn't. And that is, it's somewhat magical that we are gathered here tonight in late 2006, because the guest of honor began his teaching career at Spelman College exactly 50 years ago. So this is a golden anniversary, and this is a night of celebration long overdue. It was 18 years since my professor, for some of you, your professor, graced these halls on a daily basis. But his spirit is still felt. He is a gifted teacher, a prolific historian, and a man who, by his example and words, both spoken and written, have taught this community, this country, and this culture where true north lies in the political constellation. It is my great honor to introduce to you Professor Howard Zinn.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Well, not just for that elegant introduction, but for just being responsible for all of this. All of you people are here because of him. In fact, I am here because of him. Yeah, he got this idea and went with it. I thought he had other things to do, but apparently not. Well, it's sort of a teacher's dream, right? That 30 years later, a student shows up to thank you. But this is going too far. I'll accept it anyway. I want to thank him. I want to thank the political science department, BU, David Mayers, and especially Laura Moore of the political science department, who worked so hard on all of this. I want to thank Karen Fung of Boston University, Dean Henderson. Boston University responded with remarkable enthusiasm. And yeah, I don't know if I will ever get over it. But it's nice to be honored, I admit it. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to honor a man who taught in this building for a very long time. He's not here, not with us anymore, who probably taught more students at Boston University than anybody, any professor in the history of Boston University, who is my closest friend at BU, who walked the picket line with me, who shared with me that little part of the political science department which we called the incurable ward. Professor Murray Levin. Yeah. Yeah. And the other faculty, some of them were here tonight, who were with us in those days, who formed the union, who, along with the secretaries and the technical workers and the custodians and the librarians, all of us went on strike together in 1979. It was a great moment in the history of Boston University. So I want to thank all of them. Yes. And I want to thank also the students of that time. Some of them are here tonight, too. Some of them have come from who knows where to be here. But, the students who marched down Commonwealth Avenue in October 1969, Alex was one of them, who marched down Commonwealth Avenue to join 100,000 people on Boston Common to protest the war in Vietnam. And then those students, and I met one of them just a few minutes ago, those students who in the 1980s set up a tent colony on campus to sort of represent the shanty towns of South Africa to protest apartheid in South Africa. So I want to thank all of these people, and Alex and his wife Maureen, both of whom are the key figures in organizing this whole event and making me feel good. So my topic tonight, I pretend that I care what my topic is, but you have to do this. My topic is bringing democracy alive. It's probably my cell phone, somebody telling me, please, no more. You've done enough trouble. My cell phone has the most remarkable music. Yeah. The bringing democracy alive. So I thought, well, maybe just as a first step, we might join the campaign for the impeachment of George Bush, and Dick Cheney. A double impeachment. And the Constitution says that you are impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. They meet the qualification. High crimes, 2 wars in a few years, thousands of young Americans dead, thousands more mutilated coming home, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead, constitutional rights attacked. Just right the other day, a bill passed eliminating habeas corpus and creating the possibility that anybody in the United States, anybody, citizen, non-citizen, anybody can be picked up and designated by somebody who has been designated by either Bush or Rumsfeld, designated as an unlawful enemy combatant. And there'll be no recourse and no questions to be asked, no trials, no evidence, no due process, picked up and put away and not heard from again. That's the legal situation right now as a result of the passage of the Military Commissions Act of 2006. That's enough reason for impeachment. It could have been could have had a more drastic basis. Wars of aggression. The Nuremberg trials led to the Nuremberg principles, and which the United States was a signatory to, and for which the Nazi leaders were put on trial and hanged for wars of aggression. The United States government has engaged in a war of aggression against Iraq. I'm not suggesting drastic penalties. A mild, humane, nonviolent, even constitutional penalty, impeachment. And no jail time. Maybe community service. George Bush, a year working at a homeless shelter to just show him that there are people in the United States who don't live on ranches. And we'd have maybe Cheney at the same center to tell Bush what to do. Anyway, I thought I'd start off on a mild note. But I will talk about bringing democracy alive. I guess it'll be a theme throughout whatever I say. I want to read to you something that I came across. We always claim we came across. We don't say we looked hard for something. I just happened to come across this statement by Hermann Goering, one of my favorite writers and speakers. It comes out of actually a book called Nuremberg Diary. It was written by a man who was a psychologist who at the time of the Nuremberg trials was given the job of interviewing the top Nazi leaders who were in prison. And he took notes from these interviews. And he interviewed Hermann Goering and took notes. And I don't know whether although the interpreter spoke German and English, I don't know if Goering spoke to him in English. Goering spoke good English. He was a well-educated man, as many Nazi leaders were. Well, in the kind of spirit of education, let's say, of the Leave No Child Behind Act. You see, that is, they pass the tests. They get high test scores. And, but he asked Goering, how come you were able to bring the German people into this obviously horrible situation, this war which led to millions of them dying and utter defeat? And according to his notes, this is what Goering said: why, of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war? But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. It was that last sentence that interested me. It works the same way in any country. You mean it works the same way in a totalitarian state as in our democratic, liberal state? And what does that then tell us about democracy? And what does that then tell us about the state of democracy in our country, if that's the way it works? Well, in fact, when you really inspect the state of democracy in the United States, it turns out there is no very simple spectrum of totalitarianism on the one end and democracy on the other end. There are all sorts of gradations in between. And democracy in the United States is not at the far end of the democratic spectrum. We have a long way to go, really, to be a democracy. We always have. We don't like to say it because it's too easy to just say we're a democracy. And there are just two kinds of places, countries in the world. There are totalitarian states and there are democracies, but it isn't that way at all. I mean, we go to junior high school and we learn about what democracy is. We live in a democracy. How do we know? Well, we have a constitution. We have 3 branches of government. I remember them putting those figures, those drawings on the board. Then we have checks and balances, and they have the arrows going back and forth, executive, legislative, judicial. It was entrancing. And checks and balances. Who can forget that? And if one branch of the government does something bad, it will be checked by another branch. It means nothing can go wrong. Well, of course, then you grow up, and you get out in the world, and maybe you study a little, and you look around, and you find, no, checks and balances doesn't really work. And certainly not in foreign policy, and certainly not in going to war. There are no checks and balances on the president in going to war. The president decides on war, and then Congress, like a whole flock of sheep, goes along. I mean, you can trace this back to every war. Go to the Mexican War of 1846 and see how much debate there was in Congress on going into the Mexican War. 1 hour of debate on going into the Mexican War. We can follow this all the way through. The Congress has never been a check on the president's willingness to go to war, which is really a complete violation of the idea that James Madison had when it was originally written in the Constitution that Congress was given the power to declare war. And Madison said the reason this is so because the president is in the kind of office which is disposed to war. No checks and balances there. And no checks and balances from the Supreme Court. You would think, well, and we learned this, Supreme Court decides what is constitutional and what is not. That's comforting. Until you look at the record. And then you see that the Supreme Court will never stand in the way of an unconstitutional war. And every war we have fought since World War II has been unconstitutional. No Congress has declared war in the way that the Constitution requires ever since the end of World War II. And has the Supreme Court ever made any judgment on this? Well, it had an opportunity during the Vietnam War. It had an opportunity because 3 GIs refused to get on a plane to go to Vietnam. And they were arrested, of course, and they made their way to the Supreme Court. And their argument was, this war is unconstitutional. There was no congressional declaration as required by the Constitution. And maybe these 3 guys had gone to junior high school and learned that the Supreme Court's job is to determine what is constitutional and what is not. And what did the Supreme Court decide? The answer is, it didn't. It didn't take the case. You need 4 Supreme Court justices to even decide to take the case. They couldn't get 4 justices to even decide to take the case. So much for checks and balances. Well, in wartime, forget about checks and balances. And since we seem to be perpetually at war, and we certainly have been at war a lot since World War II, and right now there's a prospect of endless wars, then the status of democracy seems to be rather dismal. And what about free speech? And what about the First Amendment? Now, there too, again, we learn about the Bill of Rights. We learn about the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and other things. And it doesn't say Congress may make no law abridging the freedom of speech except in time of war. It doesn't say that. It's absolute. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But what does the Supreme Court decide? Oh, well, when it's wartime, you don't have free speech like you have in peacetime. I mean, the man who said this was a man who is a great liberal jurist in the history of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes. I mean, how can you get more distinguished than that? A man with 3 names. And so, a man was sent to jail. Unanimous decision of the court, written by Holmes, sent to jail for distributing leaflets on the streets of New York against the draft because it's wartime, and we cannot have that kind of freedom in wartime. Well, it's interesting. If you can't have freedom of speech in wartime, when can you have it? And when is it most important to have it? And when is it most important to have free discussion on foreign policy? So exactly at those times, exactly in those situations when you need discussion on foreign policy most, exactly in those situations when you need freedom of speech most, at those moments you don't have it. That doesn't speak well for how much democracy we have, whatever is written in the Constitution and whatever is told to us in junior high school. Well, one of the requirements, I suppose, of a democracy is a well-informed public. And one of the media for a well-informed public is the media, the newspapers and television and radio. And they're supposed to help us. They're supposed to, that's their job. They're professionals. They have the time. They're supposed to investigate what the government does. They're supposed to be like I.F. Stone, but they're not, you say. They're supposed to inform the public what's going on and be critical of what is happening and be a kind of intermediary between the government and the people. But what do we find instead? We find the media, the mass media, the big media, the corporate-owned media of this country are going along with war. I mean, all the president has to do is declare a war, and immediately the media come on board. And you saw this right at the beginning of the Iraq War. You saw the flags go up on the stands of the television commentators. And you saw, you heard Dan Rather talking about the decisions made by the government to go to war, using the word we, immediately associating himself. And just a small example of the obsequiousness of the press. In situations of war and near war and impending war. And you remember that a month before we went to war in Iraq in February of 2003, Colin Powell made that famous speech before the UN, in which he laid out this long, long list of weapons of mass destruction. Probably there's no speech ever made at the UN that contained more falsehoods in one speech than that one. Did the press ask questions? Did they ask, hey, where's your evidence? Did they remember that 2 years before Colin Powell, being nominated for his post, had said, Iraq is a beaten country. Iran is a weak and helpless country. That was 2 years before. Hadn't they remembered that since then there had been hundreds and hundreds of inspections of Iraq by an international team that had found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction? But when Colin Powell made a speech, the big newspapers climbed on board immediately. I mean, the New York Times fell all over itself in admiration of the speech. And by now, it is accustomed to that acrobatic feat. And the Washington Post said, it is hard to imagine how anyone could doubt that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction. Well, can't depend on the press. And the public is on its own. That's an important thing to know, that we are on our own, that the checks and balances won't help us, and the press won't help us. We are on our own as citizens. If democracy is to have any life, it will have it because of us, and not because of the organs of government, not even because of the Constitution, because the Constitution can be set aside very easily and is being set aside. So it's up to us. But we have problems in knowing what is going on for a number of reasons. One of them is a loss of history. If we are not given a really good historical education, we're not really in a position to understand what is going on. If we don't know history, it's as if we were born yesterday. And if you're born yesterday, anybody in authority can get up before the microphone and say, we must go to war for this reason or that reason or another reason, and you have no basis for challenging that. And if you know some history, it's a different matter. And when I say no history, I don't mean the history we get, yes, again, in junior high school, and in high school, and in college, and in the university, I'm afraid. I mean, I went all through, the history program right up to the PhD, and I must say that there was a lot that was missing in that history. So I don't mean the history that glows with admiration for our various presidents. To Andrew Jackson is a hero. Andrew Jackson, the racist, the Indian killer, the slave owner. To whom Theodore Roosevelt is a hero. Theodore Roosevelt, the lover of war, the defender of massacres in the Philippines. Those laudatory histories of military heroes. I don't mean that kind of history. I mean a history which is critical and which is independent of previous histories, of the tradition of independent of orthodox history. No, but if you knew some history which you learned by yourself, or which you got from the library, because the library is always a much, much better source of information than what you can get in the press, and very often what you can get in the institutions of learning. And if you have that kind of history, then when the president gets up to tell you to go to war, you would be skeptical, because you would know how often presidents have lied to the public in order to get them into war. You would know about how President Polk lied to the American nation about the Mexican War in 1846. And, there's been a clash on the border and American blood has been shed on American soil. Wow. It's like Pearl Harbor. It's like the Gulf of Tonkin. I'm jumping a little ahead with my, but, I don't have that much time, you see. And lies told for every war. Lies told about the Spanish-American War. We're going into Cuba to liberate the Cubans from Spanish rule. Sort of a half-truth. We did liberate the Cubans from Spanish rule, but not from our rule. Spain was out, we were in. Spain was out, and United Fruit was in. Spain was out, and the American banks and the American corporations were in, and now Cuba was ours until that terrible moment in 1959, when Castro ruined everything. And because we're against dictators, we're against, we want democracy. And so we supported all of his dictatorial predecessors until he came along. But Cuba was ours. And lies told about the Philippine War, and lies told about World War I, and lies and go on and on and on. And you know about the more recent lies, the lies about the Gulf of Tonkin and about Panama and Grenada. And there was always a reason for going to war. And turned out, of course, those were not the real reasons. There were motives. There were other motives that were not told to us. We're not told that the reason we get into the Mexican War is not because of this clash on the border, but because President Polk wanted California. I mean, who can blame him? But he wanted California. He wanted that whole great, beautiful area of the Southwest, which is now ours, which now trying to keep the Mexicans out of. Trying to keep them out of the land we stole from them. This is really, yes, of course. Lies, yeah. Yeah, there were motives. We were told one thing, and then there were real reasons for going into these places. We told we're going into the Philippines to, bring civilization and Christianity to the Filipinos. Yeah, we brought death and destruction to them, and why? Was it to bring democracy? Was it to bring civilization and Christianity to the Filipinos? No, it was because the Philippines were a wonderful entry to the mineral wealth of all of Asia. I mean, Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana sort of held up a nugget, gold nugget in the Senate and said, this is what they have in the Philippines. They were a little more honest then. You don't see senators getting up now and saying, and here is a gallon of oil. So yes, a little knowledge of history would make people more skeptical when the government urges us to go to war. And mind if I have a swig? It's not water. I think one of the reasons we're not ready to be skeptical is that I think we grow up in this country with the idea that the government is looking out for our interests. In other words, if something goes wrong, it's because the government has made a mistake. They really care about us. They really want to do the right thing by us. It's just that they make mistakes. We cannot get it through our heads that the government may not be making mistakes. It may have different interests than us. That is all that language that we get in the culture about the national defense and the national interest and national security, all those abstractions which bind us all together. Those first words in the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of the United States. And so we all grow up with the idea that, yeah, we're all, one big happy family, and that all of our interests are the same. But some history would disabuse us of that. I mean, really, but you mean George Bush's interests are the same as the interests of the young person he sends to Iraq? You mean Exxon's interests are the same as the interests of working people in this country who may work for Exxon? Some history would show us that from the beginning, this country was not united by a common interest. Long before the American Revolution, there were clashes all through the American colonies between landlords and tenants, between slaves and slave owners. There were riots of the poor in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. And then when the Revolution came, although we learned very often in our history courses that, there were the united colonists against England and British oppression. They were not united at all. The working guys went into the Revolution very often because they were promised land, not because they had any notion that they had common interests with the founding fathers. And in fact, there were mutinies and this I never learned in school. There were mutinies in the Revolutionary Army against Washington and the officers because of the way the privates were treated, their lack of food, their lack of clothes, their lack of pay, and the way the officers was treated with splendid clothes and plenty of money. Mutinies of thousands of soldiers in Washington's army. And then when the Revolutionary War ended, that conflict continued. Rebellions of farmers in Massachusetts and other places. Probably you know about Shays' Rebellion. Many people know about it only because it appears on multiple choice tests. But Shays' Rebellion, was a huge uprising of thousands and thousands of farmers in western Massachusetts and emulated in other states. Many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War, facing the same problem that veterans of any war face, and that is when they come home and they find that the promises made to them as veterans are not being kept, and they find that the country which they thought they had fought for is not exactly the same. There was after Shays' Rebellion, there was a letter written to Washington by one of his men who was a general with Washington, Henry Knox, and after Shays' Rebellion, which put a kind of fear into the Founding Fathers. Remember, Shays' Rebellion was 1786. The Constitution was 1787. And after Shays' Rebellion, Knox wrote to Washington and he said, well, I'm paraphrasing, they wrote more elegantly in those days. Our Founding Fathers, whatever you can say about them, they could write. They could speak, you know. So anything critical that I may say of them should be, you know, leavened by that thought. But Knox said to Washington, after Shays' Rebellion, he said, these people out in western Massachusetts, they think that because they fought in the Revolution, they deserve an equal share of the wealth of this country. No. The Constitution was not drawn up for the benefit of all and the common interests of all. The Constitution was drawn up by men of means, by slaveholders and merchants, and it was drawn up basically to present a strong central government which would be able to put down rebellions, which would be able to put down slave rebellions, would be able to protect the settlers as they moved out west to get rid of the Indians who thought it was their land. Conflict from the beginning, different interests from the beginning, from the Revolution on, from before the Revolution and after the Revolution, down to the present day. You can trace it in the legislation that Congress passes all through history, class legislation that serves the interests of the privileged all through, the subsidies to the railroads, the subsidies to the corporations. There were moments when there was a break in that. There were moments when Congress did pass legislation for the poor. Those were moments when people rebelled, like the 30s, and the great strikes of the 30s, or the 60s, when the great movements of the 60s. And then we got some reforms. But in general, the history of legislation in this country is a history that is class legislation. So I always get a kick out of it when election time, one candidate says of the other, accusingly, he's appealing to class antagonism. Well, it's the right thing to do. There's another problem we have in being skeptical, another sort of psychological, ideological obstacle to being properly critical, to seeing our nation and its policies very clearly. And that is it's what social scientists call American exceptionalism, the myth of American exceptionalism, the idea that we're the best, we're the greatest, we're number one. Well, there are ways in which we are number one, and there are ways in which we are great, and there are a lot of really good things you can say about this country. But to blanketly declare us the best and the most virtuous, and that's going too far. And that's where history comes in handy. History makes us honest. It's not a matter of putting ourselves down. It's a matter of being honest about ourselves and our past. I mean, you can't say, as many people do, well, it's true. No, I mean, this is a great country. Sure, we've had our little problems, like slavery, you know. But basically, you know, well, no, it's not as simple as that. And our history is a history of even a country of great wealth, enough wealth to create a middle class, but a country which has always had an underclass, a large underclass, where the wealth has always been unequally and unfairly distributed. A country of slavery and then of 100 years of racial segregation after slavery. Remember, it's very recent, only very recent, that racial segregation in this country was outlawed. So, and then, of course, our activities abroad, they say, well, in the United States, we're the good guys of the world. Oh, well, we've made a few mistakes here and there. No, we haven't been the good guys of the world. No. But that's what you grow up with. We're the Boy Scouts of the world. We help nations across the street. We haven't, and sometimes we've helped other countries. Most often we have not. Most often our aims have been imperial. And the record of the United States is a record of expansion, of continual expansion, first across the continent, destroying Native American tribes, annihilating them, pushing them farther and farther into smaller parts of the country, and then moving into the Caribbean, and then moving into the Pacific, and of course into Latin America, and recently, of course, all over the world. And it hasn't been a picture of benign imperialism, as some people like to think of it. Well, we're imperial, but they even use the term imperialism light, which may be okay for a beer, but not for imperialism. And this idea you all have a right to take out your bottles of water. I feel that I'm sort of taking advantage of the situation. This idea of us being the greatest and so on, very often it's accompanied by the idea that God has given us a special dispensation. And this goes way back, goes back to the first governor of Massachusetts, goes back to the middle of the 19th century, and the idea of manifest destiny, and that providence, that's the word they use, providence has ordained that we move across the continent, and as if God believed in ethnic cleansing. And Wilson invoked God. It's interesting, all this talk about this sort of very pompous talk about the separation of church and state. There's never been a separation of church and state. Every president has invoked God to support what he has done. Wilson did it all the time, and Clinton did it, and of course Bush has carried it to before Bush, of course, McKinley had said God told him to take the Philippines, and he did. So Bush, and Bush, this was reported in Haaretz newspaper in Israel, that the Palestinian leader reported this, that he had spoken to Bush, and Bush told him, quote, God told me to strike Al-Qaeda, and I struck them. And then he instructed me to strike at Saddam, which I did. Well, it's a little suspect, actually, that's it's a sort of second-hand source, and the grammar isn't quite right. There's a more likely source, and this is an official of the Southern Baptist Convention who says that during Bush's first campaign, Bush said to him, I believe God wants me to be president, but if that doesn't happen, that's okay. I thought that was generous. So I think we need to be honest about the historical record. The people, I think, that portion of our population which is least susceptible to the claim that we are the greatest and so on, and we have liberty and democracy and so on. I think the people who are naturally most skeptical of this are black people in this country, for, I guess, understandable reasons. And in the 1930s, Langston Hughes, the African-American poet of the Harlem Renaissance, wrote a poem entitled Columbia, Columbia representing the United States. And now this is the 1930s, and the United States had not yet gone as far as it has since then, but by the 1930s it had already gone into Cuba and taken Puerto Rico and taken Hawaii and taken the Philippines and sent Marines 20 times into Central America. And Woodrow Wilson, the great idealist, had bombarded the Mexican coast and sent an occupying army into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So there was already a record for Langston Hughes when he wrote, Columbia, my dear girl, you really haven't been a virgin so long. It's ludicrous to keep up a pretext. You're terribly involved in world assignations, and everybody knows it. You've slept with all the big powers in military uniforms, and you've taken the sweet life of all the little brown fellows in loincloths and cotton trousers. Being one of the world's big vampires, why don't you come on out and say so, like Japan and England and France and all the other nymphomaniacs of power? So, yeah. Honesty, that's what we need. We need some forthright acknowledgement. I mean, people are apologizing all over the place for ridiculous things. Let's apologize for really important things. And, isn't that what they do in Alcoholics Anonymous? Don't they get up and just tell the truth about themselves, right? So why can't we have Imperialists Anonymous, and and have the people in the White House and so on, get up before the world and confess. So when you looking at my watch to pretend that I care. When you talk the way I'm talking, which of course is nasty, it's hard to take because we're not accustomed to talking this way or to listening to stuff like this, and when you are so critical of the policies that our government has followed, and what happens? You're immediately called unpatriotic, un-American, right? You don't like America. Wait a while. You mean Bush is America? You mean those people in the White House are America? They say, well, you're putting down our country. Our country? No, not our country. You see these young fellows or young women going off to Iraq and the television cameras on them, and they're asking them, why are you going to Iraq? And they say, well, I believe I owe this to my country. No, they're not going there for their country. They're not going there for the good of their families and their community and the people of this country. They're going there for Bush. They're going there for Halliburton. They're going there for Bechtel. That's who they're going there for. But there's this confusion between the government and the country, We shouldn't be confused because we should be reading the Declaration of Independence. And that's our founding philosophical document. The Declaration of Independence makes the distinction clear that governments are artificial creations. They are set up by the people to ensure certain rights, an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when governments become destructive of these ends, these are the words of the Declaration, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. That's serious. But that's the Declaration of Independence. That's why it's put up on the classroom wall, not to be read, but to be looked at. So when you criticize the government, you're not criticizing the country, you're not criticizing America. And when a government is acting against the interests of the people, when the government is not fulfilling its obligation to bring equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness to its citizens, then the government is being unpatriotic. So I think it's very important to get that clear. Of course, our capacity to think clearly about all this becomes distorted when a climate of fear is created. When some horrible menace is declared to threaten us. And different points in history, the menace changes, but in the 1950s and during the Cold War, it was communism. Now, there are real threats, there are realities, and then there are exaggerations of those threats to the point of hysteria. And sure, there was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had occupied countries in Eastern Europe, but the communist threat was magnified to the point where any revolution, any uprising taking place anywhere in the world was part of a world communist conspiracy. And so millions of people died in Vietnam because people were made hysterical about communism. And this country has spent trillions of dollars on war for the purpose of defending ourselves against a menace that was enormously exaggerated. And that fear, communism, now is fear of terrorism. And terrorism is used as a way to make people stop thinking and as a justification for everything that is done to us, and as justification for stealing the wealth of this country, and a justification for taking away our liberties, and a justification for going to war again and again, and not giving people a chance to think about war and the war on terrorism. And how can you make war on terrorism when terrorism itself is war? And war is terrorism. War is the greatest terrorism. The terrorism of small bands of people who blow up buildings and who are suicide bombers, I mean, that's bad, and that is terrorism. But that's very small compared to the terrorism of governments. Governments have enormous capacity to kill millions of people, and they do. But that is concealed from us by making us focus on these bands of people who are terrorists. We need to think about the way terrorism is used. We need, and we need to think about war itself. I don't mean just this war. I don't mean just the war in Iraq. Because the war in Iraq will come to an end. I don't know when, but it will come to an end at some point. Who knows at what cost, but it will come to an end. It has to, because we don't belong in Iraq. Our presence there is already crumbling, and we are not going to stay in Iraq. And so the war in Iraq may be over at some point. But then what about the next war, and the next war, and the next war? Are we going to have anti-war movement after anti-war movement after anti-war movement? It seems to me we must, and I know this is a big job, we must think about the abolition of war itself. War. War is the enemy. War. And we have to come to a recognition that war solves no fundamental problems. I say this as somebody who was in a war, no, not the Spanish-American War. But I was in the good war, the best of wars. The war which has probably the greatest claim to any kind of moral center, and yet that war was accompanied by atrocities of all kinds, whether it's Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden, or a bombing raid that I engaged in dropping napalm on a little French village, or battles which killed huge numbers of people. That war, the good war, which you might say is the putting war to the extreme test, and even that war was deeply, deeply flawed in the moral sense. And every war since has not even had that moral core, and yet World War II is used as a metaphor for all these other wars. They draw upon the language of World War II and Churchill and appeasement and Munich and all of that. They draw upon the moral capital of World War II to put a glow on every ugly war we have fought since World War II. War has reached a point with the technology of war where it cannot be accepted as a way of solving any problem in the world, whether there's a dictator somewhere, whether a border has been crossed. It cannot be accepted because war, by definition, is the massive and indiscriminate killing of innocent people. War has become more and more the killing of civilians. In World War I, the ratio of military to civilians, 10 to 1. In World War II, about 50-50. 50% civilians, 50% military. In Vietnam, 70% of those millions who died were civilians. Now it's more like 80 and 90% civilians, men, women, and children. War is inevitably a war against children, and therefore it cannot be accepted. And therefore we must, even if it's a long-term goal, we must think about its abolition. Just as people in the 1830s in this country, although the end of slavery was far off, they began to think about the abolition of slavery. So, what shall we do? Well, I think we learning from history, being honest about the past and about what's going on today, we have to come to the conclusion that we cannot depend on the government for justice. We cannot depend on the press for justice. We cannot depend on the opposition party, because there is not much of an opposition party. And, whatever. There's some possibilities for opposition in that party. If the Democrats win the House, John Conyers will be head of the Judiciary Committee, and he has been a leading force for impeachment, so that's good. But in general, no, we can't have to depend on ourselves. And historically, this is what you see. When any serious injustice had to be remedied, it was not initiated by the government or the President or Congress or the Supreme Court. It was done by the people themselves organizing, protesting, sacrificing, risking. The labor movement did not win the 8-hour day because Congress passed a law or the President an edict or the Supreme Court. The working people won the 8-hour day because they did it themselves. There was nothing in the Constitution. There's no economic Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Although Roosevelt in 1944 asked for an economic Bill of Rights, no economic Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Working people had to do it themselves, and they did. They went out on strike, and they faced the police and the National Guard and the Army, and they won. And the same thing was true of people in the South, black people in the South. They learned very soon they could not depend on the Constitution. Oh, sure, the 14th and 15th Amendments. No president enforced the 14th and 15th Amendments. Every president for almost 100 years violated his oath of office, which is to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And no president enforced, and up to Johnson and Kennedy, none of them enforced the 14th and 15th Amendments until black people went out into the streets all over the South and created the kind of commotion and went to jail, and some of them were killed, and created the kind of commotion that aroused the nation and aroused the world and embarrassed the American government into finally passing some legislation so that the 14th and 15th Amendments could have some meaning. At those moments, democracy came alive. And that's what we need today. We need democracy to come alive today. And it's possible. Generally, people feel powerless, but keep this in mind. The people in power only hold their power because of our obedience. Really. When the obedience of the population disappears, the people in power no longer have their power. Corporations need workers to work. If the workers stop working, the corporation is helpless. If they declare a boycott of grapes, however powerful farm growers are, they will give in if people stop buying grapes. When soldiers begin to rebel, as they did in Vietnam in the last few years of the anti-war movement, then the government has to take cognizance of that. Yeah, they depend on our obedience, and our job is to begin withholding our obedience and declaring that we ourselves are going to be the agents of democracy, and we ourselves are going to bring democracy alive in this country. And you'll hear them say, people in power will say, well, no, we will never submit. We will never give in. We will never cut and run. Well, we will always do. No. The history is littered with the confident statements of people in power that they will never give in, and they did. Dictators who seem to have absolute power wake up one morning and there's 1 million people in the Capitol, and they're on a helicopter flying off somewhere. And in South Africa, they said, we will never end apartheid, but they ended apartheid. George Wallace said to meetings in the South, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And a few years later, segregation was ended in Alabama. I remember a moment in 1965, and I joined the march from Selma to Montgomery in the spring of 1965. On the last night before the last leg of the march, the 20 miles to Montgomery, that last night we all were in our sleeping bags. It had poured rain the night before, and our sleeping bags were resting in the mud of this field. And that's how we spent the night. And then the next day, we marched 20 miles to Montgomery. An amazing scene. We got to Montgomery. I decided I wasn't going to hang around for the speeches. I wanted to go home. Much of my revolutionary activity has been cut short by my wanting to go home. So I made my way to the airport in Montgomery, and I was splattered with mud. And there I ran into a man who had just arrived in Montgomery to be at the proceedings. This was Whitney Young, who had been my colleague and friend in Atlanta, tall, black man, distinguished looking, and so we decided we'd have a cup of coffee together. Well, restaurants in Selma were still segregated. But we went into the cafeteria and we sat down. This young woman came over to us and stopped. And I could see in her eyes this conflict. What is she going to do? And then she turned to Whitney and she said, "May I serve you, sir?" And then I looked at her apron, and she had a big button on it which says, "The Deep South says never." Well, keep this in mind. All those statements will shatter immediately as soon as people get together, as soon as people organize. And people don't have to do heroic things. All of us, very few of us can do heroic things, but we can do little things. And at certain points in history, millions of those little things accumulate, come together, and you have a movement, and you have power, and something changes. So I want to close by reading a poem written by Marge Piercy. It's from her book, The Moon is Always Female. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything. You can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. He goes on, one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say, we, and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I was told we have a question period. I was told the question period will go to 8:30. That gives you 5 minutes. It's a typical freedom of speech situation. But maybe we can take more than that. Are there 2 microphones or 1? Oh, there are 2. Yeah, I can't see too well, but the honor system will alternate, okay? That mic first, and then you. And when somebody in authority gives me the signal, we'll quit. Okay?
Good evening, Mr. Zinn. I don't think I need to say how much I admire you, but I just want to ask you a question. I'm from Puerto Rico, and as you probably know, Nelson Miles, the same guy that exterminated a lot of Indians here in the United States, came to Puerto Rico in 1898 to bestow upon us the blessings of American institutions and to free us from our own miserable condition. And I guess that 108 years later, Americans are still freeing us. But I don't know from what, because I don't feel free at all. We are a Latin American nation subjected to the power of a president and a Congress that we do not elect. And the president of the United States can send a Puerto Rican to die on an unjust war in Iraq. A poor Puerto Rican, by the way. So I wanted to know, what do you think are the prospects for Puerto Rican decolonization? And do you think, and I guess you do, that this is very relevant to the topic that we're discussing today, bringing democracy alive, allowing a nation to determine its own future and being the owner of its own land?
Well, you know what I think. And you've said it so eloquently, and you know the situation there, better than I and better than most of us. And the question you ask is, do I think something will change? We extrapolate from little victories to the future. And the United States was using the island of Vieques, right? The island was using the Puerto Rican island of Vieques as a bombing target, as a test site, and the people of Vieques protested year after year. Yeah, they protested, and finally the protests grew so strenuous and so threatening that the United States had to withdraw from Vieques. It's possible to win small victories and to understand that once you can win small victories, you can win big ones. And so my hope is that the people of Puerto Rico will get what they want at some point. If they have people like you working, and they'll make it, I'm sure.
Hi, Howard. I had you in class in 1972, and so I'm very appreciative to have a chance to actually be in class with you again tonight after so many years, and I thank the committee, whoever put this together. It's just a wonderful, wonderful evening. I had a question for you about the origins of the Iraq War. You mentioned that you thought, part of the motivation was for Halliburton and for Bechtel and other big companies. I was curious whether you thought the Bush family's relationship with Saudi Arabia has a relationship to why we're in Iraq. We were, after all, attacked on September 11 by jets that were manned not by Iraqis, but by 15 Saudis, 15 out of the 19 hijackers. And yet, instead of attacking Saudi Arabia or doing anything against Saudi Arabia, we attack Iraq. So I'd like you to comment about that, whether you feel that there's some connection with the Bush family for, protecting Saudi Arabia involved. And then secondly, I have a second question. I hate to ask two, but the second question is, if there is a connection, and if the Bush family is protecting Saudi Arabia and favoring the interests of that country over the United States, where we were attacked on September 11, it seems to me that one of the grounds for impeachment should be treason. And I don't think it should be community service, the penalty paid for treason. And I wanted you to comment on that, too. Thanks.
I'll answer the first question. The easy one. But you ask, how come we fixed on, remember, first Afghanistan and then Iraq? And why not Saudi Arabia? Well, the answer is simple. Saudi Arabia is our friend, our ally. They can do whatever they want. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is sort of a deep friendship, a heartwarming friendship. It goes back to the end of World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt met Ibn Saud in 1945, and they made a deal. And the deal was that from now on, the United States is going to be the major player in the oil fields of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. The English and the French and the Dutch were going to be eased out. And in return, the United States would maintain the power of the Saudi monarchy, no matter what they did to women, no matter what they did to their own people, no matter what they were like, no matter how many hijackers would come out of their country in the future. They are our friends. It's an old principle in American foreign policy. If there's a country which does what you want, you let it do what it wants, no matter what it does. And that's been our attitude towards Saudi Arabia.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk. It's so interesting and thought-provoking. I wanted to know if you think there are any other countries that exercise their democracy better than the U.S., and if so, why?
If there's any other country that what?
That exercise their democracies better than the U.S.,
Oh,
and if
any
so,
other
why?
country that has democracy, exercise democracy better than the U.S.? It's interesting. This always comes up. And this is no slight on you to say that you aren't the first one to ask this question, but it's a question that comes up because when you criticize the United States, very often a question, and this may not be the intent of your question, very often there's a kind of challenging question. Well, where would you rather live? Well, why don't you go back to, well, actually, I like living here. See, there's the Red Sox, and there's Dunkin' Donuts, and there's a lot of good things. And it's a beautiful country. It's a beautiful country. It's been taken over by a little gang, you see. But are there countries that are more democratic? Democracy, and this is what I tried to say, there's a spectrum, and it's very complicated. There are countries that have more economic democracy than we do. There are countries that have free medical care for everybody. There are countries that take better care of their children and their old people than we do. The economic aspect of democracy is a very important one. And there are countries which in their foreign policy are not as aggressive and bullying and violent as the United States. Lots of them. I mean, there are lots of countries in the world that don't worry about terrorism the way we do. These are countries that don't bother anybody. We bother other places in the world very seriously. And so yes, there's no country which is ideal. And it's not, there's no one a perfect place that I can say is a democracy. They all have their problems, but no, we're more democratic than a lot of countries in the world. Although there's no country in the world that is more aggressive in our foreign policy than us. But it's, the question, where countries place on this complicated spectrum of democratic and less democratic, is very complicated. There are 25 countries in the world that have better records in infant mortality than we do. There are 30 countries in the world that have better literacy rates than we do. There are many, many countries. I mean, this is according to, the international organizations that study this, so all I'm saying is everybody in every country has the problem of making their country more democratic. And I think it's probably a good idea to take a clear-eyed look at where we are and not just measure us by the worst places in the world to say, well, you see, we're much better than they are, but to measure ourselves against the kind of country we should be. And it should be a country where people are taken care of, a country without racism, and a country that is not militarized, and a country that doesn't spend its wealth on guns and bombs, a country that, yes, it can be a superpower, but it should be not a military superpower, but a humanitarian superpower, and that's what we should be aiming for.
Howard, thank you.
Hi, Jim.
You mentioned GIs refusing to go to Vietnam, and I just want to emphasize that nobody can make you go to Iraq It takes courage and it's difficult, but you can refuse to go to Iraq even if you're in the military. And I want to bring up the example of Lieutenant Aaron Watada, who is the first commissioned officer to refuse deployment to Iraq. And I bring it up in part to ask you to comment on his, I believe, very courageous act and very profoundly moral act of resistance, but also to invite everybody here to come on Sunday evening to hear his father, Bob Watada, and some other well-known speakers and performers at an event to support him at a church in Harvard Square, the First Parish Church, Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. And that event is organized by the Smedley Butler Brigade, a chapter of Massachusetts Veterans for Peace.
Jim, I have a feeling that's not a question but an announcement, which is a good announcement, and I'm with it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Howard, would you like to say anything at all by way of just slight elaboration from what you know about the case of Lieutenant Watada?
No, actually, there's no point in my elaborating. You know more about the case than I do. I know, I've heard about it, but I don't know a lot about it. And you've told us a little about it, and, it's very clear what's right and wrong in this case. Anybody who refuses duty in this ugly war should be supported and applauded. And we will need more acts of civil disobedience in this country if the war is going to come to an end. Yes.
Good evening, Professor. I know you've talked a lot about rebellion, but is it really possible to work for change within our own government?
Is it possible what?
To work for change within our own government.
To work for change within our own government. Is it possible? Barely. That is, it's possible, but not easy. That is, the tendency is, and it's understandable. You think, well, I want to get in there where the power is and do what I can. But what happens most often with people who go into government hoping to change government policy is generally they get swallowed up in the bureaucracy and they find themselves surrounded and shouted down. And even if they get up high, even if they're up there at cabinet meetings and well, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was there at cabinet meetings when they're discussing the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and he was opposed to it, but what could he do? At least he didn't feel he could do anything. There were all these brass around him, and he felt intimidated. There are occasional rebellions of people inside the government, occasional heroic rebellions, very occasional. Daniel Ellsberg is, who brought the Pentagon Papers to light. There's an example of somebody who was in the government and then did something remarkable in exposing the secrets of the government. But in general, if I had to give advice, and I very often was asked for this advice when I was teaching, and young people come to me and say, well, I really want to change things. Should I go into the Foreign Service? No. Or I really want to do something great. Should I go to law school? Alex McDonald can answer that question better than I can. But I would say maybe. Because we've had most people go into law, end up submerged under huge volumes of corporate law and insurance law and so on and so forth. But there are a minority of lawyers who do wonderful things, and on behalf of the poor and on behalf of people who've been charged with crimes and people who don't have any help. So anyway, I'll take, how many more questions? I think, One more from each mic, okay?
Well, I go to school here, and like so many of your students in the 60s and 70s, and yourself as well, I make the same commute, in Commonwealth, day in and day out, class, work, sleep, all that. But unlike your students, it just seems to me that that passion just isn't there. I just see 44,000 people, like so many shades, just going in and out, day in and day out, self-absorbed, and I completely put myself in this same malady of our generation right now. And I don't know, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's 44,000 of us. That's if we each put down $1, we could come up with another kid's tuition, but 44,000 of us, and how the hell do we get it together? How do we, Jesus Christ, it's enervating.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not. I didn't hear everything you said, so but my general answer to most questions is I don't know. But who are these 44,000 people you're talking about?
All of us. The 44,000 of us that go to this school, the 44,000 students that attend BU that,
44,000 at BU.
Right.
Oh, I see.
I'm just saying, compare to the passion that seems to me that was there in the 60s and 70s, and just that drive, that unifying drive towards change. I just feel a lack in that, and
we all feel the same way. As well, we all feel very small and powerless, and we look at all the people around us who are not doing anything, just concentrating on their lives. But that's how things happen. When you aren't discouraged by that, when you go on, when you keep on, and you join whoever you can find, 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, and you persist. A social change doesn't come quickly, doesn't come easily. It requires a lot of patience, not the patience of passivity, but the patience of persistence in whatever you do, and a kind of faith that if you keep doing what you're doing and keep working and keep defying the orthodoxy of the society around you, that more and more people will gather around. And there are people all over the country that you don't know about who feel the same way and who are organizing and are doing things. And this is a very big country, and you very often have no idea what is happening in the rest of the country. But the fact is, and I travel a lot around the country, and wherever you go in this country, however small the town, there are always little clusters of people working for good things, for equal rights for women, for against racism, for the environment. I'm encouraged by the existence of these people and by the knowledge that small movements become large movements with patience and persistence.
Hi. I was on campus here in the 80s, and when I first got here, people told me you have to get into a Zinn class. And at the time, I had to be an upperclassman in order to get in because the draw was so high. And then by the time I got to be an upperclassman, you had to be in the right major. You had to be a grad student. So I've been waiting 20 years to actually supposed to be here, to be listening to you, because I had to sneak into your lectures when I was actually an undergrad. But I guess I have a question to ask and then a favor. Given the political climate, as you said, the different places that we've been and how we've tried to impose our foreign policy, and at the time that, as you mentioned, Castro, making his own decision, given how unstable small aircraft seem to be with the leaders of countries that we don't happen to like at the time,
My favor is that should the opportunity ever arise that you were offered the opportunity to be in a plane with Hugo Chavez, please don't. I think the temptation would be too much. And the question I have is, if we were to use the Constitution to perhaps a couple months down the road ultimately make Nancy Pelosi the first female president of the United States, do we have to impeach Cheney and Bush at the same time, or is there a particular order that we have to do that in?
Well, let's wait and see what who's going to become Speaker of the House and what the order of succession will be, and then you and I can sit down and plan our strategy.
I'm Alex's wife, BU School of Medicine 76, but for Alex to let me get up here is a big challenge. Howard, you had my heart stir in the last few minutes of your speech. It was really stirred. I felt like a blessed American again when I heard the hope about bringing democracy alive. And I could be accused of nostalgia, because to hear those stories again about the civil rights movement, for example, made me go back to the individuals involved here, because we're honoring an individual. And there's so many young students here, including my two daughters and their college friends, that it is the power of our meeting one-on-one that I think inevitably will give us hope. And it was because my husband met you that it's not just a Pat Hollywood movie ending, Mr. Holland's opus. It is inspiring that you met Alex and you met so many untold students. So if each one of those 44,000 students wants to give up a Starbucks, we could pay for 2 students to be leaders and to perhaps meet someone else. So the power of what you stirred my heart at the end is exactly what you did here every day and touched my husband, and what a dream come true for him and for me. And take those dreams and carry them out into the world. There is still hope. Thank you, Howard.